In this module, I'm going to discuss a distributed resource scheduler, or DRS. I'm also going to discuss a storage DRS and a distributed power management. After we go through the slides and cover the theoretical part of this, we'll get to our vSphere Web Client and implement both DRS, storage DRS, and DPM. So let's get started with this here. I have some basic information here on DRS. So DRS is a feature that is implemented on the cluster level. It allows for the aggregating and balancing of resources across our hosts in that cluster. In the backend, it uses vMotion to move virtual machines from hosts that are running near capacity, moving them over to hosts that are less underutilized, or hosts that are underutilized. Okay. With DRS implemented on a cluster, when the virtual machine is powered on, DRS would make a determination to place that VM on the appropriate host. Okay, and this would be based on the automation level that we would have chosen during the implementation of DRS. And this could range from conservative to aggressive. But we'll have a look at this once we implement this on our cluster. Apart from the initial placement, DRS could also continuously work to monitor and move our VM workload around within the cluster. And it does this by migrating the virtual machines to basically improve performance. Okay, so I have a slide here with the different requirements for DRS. So for this to be successful, we have a number of requirements that should be met. For one, we would need some sort of shared storage that is accessible to all our hosts. Okay, or at least those hosts that would be participating in this DRS cluster. This data store should be large enough to accommodate the virtual disk for all of our virtual machines. Okay, or all of our virtual machines that are running on those hosts that would participate in the cluster. Also, since DRS uses vMotion in the backend to move VMs around, we would want to ensure that all of the vMotion requirements are met, including utilizing the enhanced vMotion compatibility, or EVC. So this is basically to ensure that all of our hosts in the cluster present the same CPU features to the VM. And finally, DRS requires the vSphere Enterprise licensing. So basically, Enterprise and above, Enterprise Plus. Okay, so you'll just want to double check on your licensing feature there. Actually, let's just double check on this the licensing feature. Which one enables DRS? I'm almost certain is vSphere Enterprise and above. Let me pull this up really fast. Okay, as for VMware documentation here, should be let's look for this in our list here. Okay, so we have storage DRS here. This requires Enterprise Plus. DRS should be in here. Okay, here it is, Distributed Resource Scheduler and DPM. Okay, so for DRS, we need at least Enterprise, vSphere Enterprise license, and for storage DRS, we would need Enterprise Plus. Just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so here we have the different DRS automation level. I'll save the discussion for this. Once we get to our vSphere web client and we're configuring this, I'll go through these three levels here. Okay. So next we have distributed power management. The DPM settings, these are configured around the same time with DRS. It's in the same Windows option there once we're configuring this. So the distributed power management or DPM feature, this optimizes power consumption of hosts within our cluster. So DPM would compute the VM workload and place hosts in standby mode if there is a low workload. It would power on the host in the cluster to facilitate the workload should it increase. All right. We can also configure DPM or just make or set it to just make recommendations for us and not really implement any of those recommendations. So an ideal use case for this really is if your workload in the evening decreases. You could configure this so it could have some of your hosts poured off in the evening. And once the workload increase during the next working day, it could automatically bring your servers up to facilitate that additional workload. Okay, so next I have the different levels for DPM here, the configuration levels. Um, I'll save the discussion for this too once we get to the vSphere web client. So once we get there, I'll explain these three options. Well, two basically here. All right, so let me pull up my vSphere web client and then we'll configure this. Okay, as I mentioned, this is configured at the cluster level. So if you go in the host and cluster view. Okay, so before I continue here, we're dealing with DRS here. And DRS really balance the resource, the compute and memory resources in our cluster. Okay, storage DRS is very similar to DRS, where it would make the initial recommendation or placement, and then it could move our resources around for that VM during operation. Storage DRS does that for your VM files. Okay, so DRS for your compute and memory resources, storage DRS for your VM files. So rather than implementing it at the cluster level, storage DRS, we'll do that at the data store cluster level. So I'll get into the demonstration of that in a little bit, where I would create a data store cluster so we could demonstrate storage DRS. But for now, let's take a look at DRS and DPM. So I was doing some work earlier here, and I turned this on. By default, DRS and DPM, they are turned off. Okay. So if we go to the cluster here and under settings for the cluster, here we have it, DRS automation. So if we go ahead, go over to the right here and hit on edit. So here we have it. Our automation level for this. We have three levels here. Manually, partially automated, and fully automated. So by default, this is set to off. So we turn this on, and then we could set the automation level here. So the manual setting, this would make recommendation to us, but it would do no automation, or it will just make the recommendation and would not implement it. Okay, we would need to manually implement the recommendation. Ideally, we would want to use this setting to see the impact that DRS would have in our infrastructure without making any changes. So once the VM is powered on, we would see this recommendation. Okay. Actually, before we continue, let me just cancel out of here, or let me just okay this. So DRS is turned on. Before we look through the other settings, let me just demonstrate that. So I have a VM here that is running on one of the hosts that is part of cluster 1 here. If I was to go ahead and power this on, and this is the recommendation that I'm talking about. So before this VM comes up, it would make this recommendation here. Okay, so it's recommending that the DSL3, this VM name, be placed on ESXi 1. Okay, so we could go ahead and manually implement that recommendation. All right, so in my case here, I have DRS implemented, but not actually functioning because it's in manual mode. It'll just highlight those recommendations for us, but won't actually balance our resources or make that initial placement for us of that VM. So let's go back and look at the other settings here. Okay, so next in our list we have partially automated. This setting would automatically place our VM on the appropriate host at startup based on performance and resource needs. After the initial placement, we will have recommendations on moving our VM workload around. So we'll have that recommendation on moving our workload around our host, but no actual implementation of those recommendations. So partially automated, it would automate the initial placement of the VM on the appropriate host, but it would not continuously monitor that VM within the host to balance the utilization, or on that host. Sorry. Next, we have fully automated. So we would use the fully automated option if we need DRS to simply work without any input from us. So this would make the initial placement of our VM and then move our workload around in the cluster should the opportunity to balance the workload of our cluster. We will see later too that we could also set the sensitivity for this by using the migration threshold setting. Okay, so if you need this to be fully automated, you set this here. It will go ahead make the initial placement and then also balance our resource utilization within the cluster. Okay, and that wouldn't really require any input from us. So let's click on this here. This is the threshold I was talking about, the migration threshold. Okay, it's from conservative to aggressive here. So as we move this, we should see the numbers change here, the priority. Okay. Also, we have the different automation here. Well, sorry, not the different, but overriding the automation level for per VM level. Okay, so before I move to power management, let me just cancel out of here and just show you guys where we would implement this. So the VM override setting here. This is where we would create a override setting for one of our VM. So we could go ahead and say, okay, we implement DRS on the cluster, but then we come here and for DSL3, we need to do a different automation level, for example. Okay, this is where we would configure that. the Power VM setting. For the storage ERS, the override for that is different from this. So, but we'll get to that once I create the data store cluster and stuff like that. So let me just cancel here and go back to my cluster again. Cluster settings. And then come back to DRS. And then actually let's just go to DPM here, our power management settings. So we have a few options here. By default, this is set to off. Okay. When this is set to off, we will not have any recommendation for DPM. We could, however, configure our individual hosts within the cluster to override this, just like we saw just now. And then we could override that with the manual or automatic setting. All right. So manual, if you were to select manual here for DPM, it would make recommendation on the VM movement within the cluster, but would not, but would require confirmation from the admin to have that run. Okay, so in this case here, we'll just make the recommendation, but we'll need to confirm it for this to continue. Automatic, this would automatically execute the power management related settings that is configured without any input from us. And just like DRS, we have a threshold here. Okay, so we have for DPM threshold from conservative to aggressive. So this is basically from priority 1, which is the most important, to priority 5. Okay. So we have it from priority 1 to priority 5. 1 is the most important to 5, which is the least important. So basically, a higher priority level would translate to a more attractive opportunity for power saving. Okay, so as we see here, the default is at 3. So once we enable this, the default is configured here at 3. And that's about it for DRS. Also at the cluster level here, it's under the summary tab, yes. So under the summary tab for our cluster, if we were to go to vSphere DRS here, it will show us our current recommendations here. If we had any recommendations for this, or if we had any fault. And it would show us also if our cluster is currently balanced. This one is currently off balance because I'm manually running DRS in my case. In this case here, I'm not really applying any of the recommendations. Okay, so that's it for DRS. For storage DRS, to get started with that, we'll need to create a data store cluster. So storage ERS, we are basically making the initial decision on placement for VM files rather than the memory and compute resource. So we'll need to implement that at a data store cluster level, not at the regular cluster level here. So for us to do that, let's go to data store view or storage view here. Okay, so if we right click here and go to storage, right click our data center, go to storage, we should be able to create a new data store cluster here. Okay, so let's call this data store cluster 1. And here we have the option of turning on storage ERS. But for now, I'll uncheck this. I want us to manually configure this, so I'll uncheck that and then hit on next here. Okay, so we'll go through these settings. Basically, it's a manual mode here. If we were implementing storage ERS as we create this data store cluster, um, so it would make a recommendation similarly like DRS, and fully automated. It would automatically migrate the files within our data store cluster from the different data stores. Okay. We could override these settings to per virtual machine. So let's just hit next. We have our runtime setting here. We're not implementing this currently, so we'll just skip over. So here, it's asking us select the host and cluster that we want to work with, storage ERS to work with. So I'll just select cluster 1 because that's the only one I have a host installed into right now. So I'll go ahead and hit next here. Okay, so let's just view all the data store within this cluster. Okay. So let's say we were creating a data store cluster with our WinSAN here data store. Ideally, we would want to create this onto a shared storage data store. All right. Let's just do this. Okay. So let's just assume we're running this on two shared storage data store right now. I'll just hit on next. We'll have a little summary here of what it's going to do. And I'll just hit on finish here. Okay. So now, as you can see on the left here, we have a new object. We name it data store cluster 1. If I was to click on this drop down here, I'll see the two data store that are part of this cluster. Okay. If I was to go to the manage setting for this cluster, okay, so cluster manage over here, we're managing data store cluster 1. And then over on the left here, we have our VM override setting. We have our storage DRS setting here, but let's look at this first. Similarly to DRS, we could override the setting that we configure at the storage DRS level. We'll just need to add the VM here. Okay, so let's just choose the VM that we want to work with. Okay, so once you configure storage DRS, then we could come in here and modify these settings. So actually, let's do that first. As we would have noticed too with DRS, whilst we was configuring that, we had this option here of scheduling our DRS. So if we want to do this after hours, for example, we could schedule this. Okay, so here you would set your options for when you want this to run. Okay, if you want this to run in the evening after hours, working hours, you could run this here. Okay, so the setting I wanted to show you guys was the storage ERS option here. Okay, so the same automation level we spoke about previously, once we turn on this here, we have those automation level here. Okay, and then we have our iometric, and that's basically it for storage ERS. Once we configure this, we would have those options when we power our VM2. So let's just go ahead and power this on. Sorry, turn that on. Okay, so once we have this implemented, We can also view this by going to our summary. So we're still under data store cluster here. Summary for storage DRS. We have some basic information here. Okay, for one, it's telling us that we're running out of space on this data store, on this cluster actually. Okay, and then we'll have some information on the cluster resources, the virtual machine that are currently stored within this cluster. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover in this section for DRS, storage DRS, and DPM. So let me just get out of here. Yes. So thank you for joining me here. In our next and final module, we'll cover a few miscellaneous, well, a couple miscellaneous topics like tags and host profiles. We'll cover those, and once we cover the theoretical part, we'll go into our vSphere Web Client and demonstrate those, and we would close off the this advanced vSphere course.